The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere over the Persian Gulf. Major Kieran, Sandstorm Valdez pressed her headset closer, the familiar weight of doubt already settling in the voices on the other end. 3 days into what should have been a routine extraction, and everything had gone sideways. The Navy SEALs were pinned down on a beach in hostile territory, their original exfil compromised, and now they were asking for the impossible. "Sandstorm, this is Neptune 6, came the voice of Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, barely audible through the interference. "Runway's gone. Repeat, runway is completely destroyed. We need immediate extraction, 43 souls on deck." The C-130J Super Hercules shuddered through turbulence as Kieran banked left, her co-pilot Captain James "Torch" Morrison already pulling up satellite imagery on the tactical display. What they saw made his face go pale in the green glow of the instruments. The airstrip that had been their primary landing zone was now a crater-pocked wasteland, courtesy of enemy mortars that had found their mark just after midnight. "Neptune 6, Sandstorm." Kieran's voice carried the calm authority that had earned her the call sign during her tour in Afghanistan, where she'd navigated sandstorms that would ground lesser pilots. "What's your current position relative to the beach?" 200 meters inland, taking heavy fire from the tree line. "We've got wounded, Sandstorm. Can't hold this position much longer." Torch shook his head, running calculations on his tablet. "Boss, even if we could get close, there's nowhere to put down. That beach is maybe 800 meters of wet sand, and that's if the tide's cooperating." But Kieran was already studying the coastline through her night vision, her mind working through possibilities that existed only in the realm of the desperate and the brilliant. She'd grown up on the beaches of Northern California, watching her grandfather's stories of World War II come alive in the crash of waves against sand. He told her about pilots who'd done impossible things when lives hung in the balance, about how the ocean could be both enemy and ally in the same breath. The mockery would come later, she knew. It always did. The same voices that questioned whether a woman belonged in the cockpit of a $67 million aircraft would be the first to call this mission suicide. They'd point to the technical manuals, the safety protocols, the 1,000 reasons why a four-engine turboprop wasn't designed for beach landings. But 43 American servicemen were counting on her to ignore every one of those voices and find a way to bring them home. The C-130's engines hummed their steady rhythm as Kieran dropped altitude, the dark waters of the Gulf stretching endlessly below. In 12 minutes, she would either pull off the most audacious landing in modern military aviation, or become another cautionary tale whispered in ready rooms across the fleet. The only certainty was that retreat wasn't an option. Not for Neptune 6, and not for the pilot they'd nicknamed Sandstorm for her ability to fly through the impossible. Webb's voice crackled through the radio again, more urgent now. "Sandstorm, we need that miracle. How copy?" Kieran's response was steady, betraying none of the calculations racing through her mind. "Copy all, Neptune 6. Miracle inbound. Stand by for the show of your lives." The loadmaster, Technical Sergeant Rosa Delgado, secured the cargo bay with practiced efficiency, her movements reflecting the unspoken trust that bound the crew together. She'd flown with Kieran through 3 combat deployments, and she knew that tone in her pilot's voice. It meant they were about to attempt something that would either be classified heroic or catastrophic, with no middle ground between them. As the C-130 descended toward the coordinates Neptune 6 had provided, Kieran felt the familiar weight of command settling on her shoulders. Every decision from this moment forward would ripple through the lives of her crew and the men waiting on that beach. The margin for error was measured in inches and seconds, with the unforgiving physics of a 75-ton aircraft serving as the final arbiter of success or failure. The tactical frequency exploded with chatter as words spread through the command structure. Operations centers from Kuwait to Norfolk began tracking their descent, and Kieran could almost hear the sharp intake of breath from the senior officers who were just now learning about the impossible extraction their pilot was attempting. Some would call it reckless. Others would call it necessary. But for the next few minutes, the only opinion that mattered was the one belonging to the woman whose hands were steady on the controls, her eyes fixed on a stretch of beach that was about to become either her greatest triumph or her final mistake. The C-130's landing lights pierced the darkness as Kieran brought the aircraft down to 500 feet, the beach now visible as a pale ribbon between the dark ocean and the hostile inland terrain where muzzle flashes marked the SEAL team's defensive perimeter. Torch worked frantically with the flight engineer, adjusting power settings and configurations for a landing that existed nowhere in their training manuals. "Sandstorm, this is Olympus Base," came the voice of Colonel Patricia Hayes, the mission commander who had personally selected Kieran for this deployment. "Be advised, we're tracking your position. Confirm your intentions for extraction." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kieran knew that Hayes was giving her an out, a chance to abort the mission and circle back for a conventional pickup at a predetermined alternate site. It was the safe choice, the textbook choice, the choice that would keep the aircraft intact and the crew alive. It was also the choice that would condemn Neptune 6 to an increasingly desperate fight against overwhelming odds. "Olympus, Sandstorm," Kieran replied, her voice carrying a quiet determination that silenced the frequency. "Requesting clearance for unconventional landing. We're bringing everyone home tonight." The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever, filled with the weight of careers and lives hanging in the balance. When Hayes finally responded, her voice carried the resignation of a commander who understood that sometimes the impossible was the only option left. "Sandstorm, you are cleared for unconventional landing. Godspeed." Below them, the beach looked impossibly narrow, a sliver of sand between the pounding surf and the vegetation line where enemy forces were zeroing in on the SEAL positions. The tide was coming in, and what little margin they had was disappearing with each passing minute. But Kieran had studied the satellite data, had analyzed wind patterns and sand compaction, and somewhere in the intersection of skill, desperation, and pure audacity, she'd found a path forward. The C-130 banked hard left as Kieran lined up for her approach, the aircraft's massive wings catching the offshore breeze that would either save them or doom them. In the cargo bay, Delgado and her team prepared for an extraction unlike anything in their training, while in the cockpit, Torch called out airspeed and altitude with the precision of a man who understood that every number mattered now. On the beach below, 43 American warriors prepared to witness something that would be talked about in military circles for decades to come, assuming anyone survived to tell the story. The first indication that this wouldn't be a routine night came when Captain Webb heard the distinctive whistle of turboprop engines cutting through the darkness above their position. He'd called for air support before, but the sound approaching from the south was different, heavier, more deliberate, like the sky itself was descending to meet them. "All Neptune elements, this is Neptune 6, Webb transmitted to his scattered teams. "Sandstorm inbound for pickup. Maintain suppressing fire on the tree line, but be ready to move on my command." Petty Officer First Class Miguel Santos, the team's senior medic, looked up from the wounded Marine he'd been treating and shook his head in disbelief. "Skipper, you said pickup. Where exactly are we supposed to go? That bird sounds way too big for a hello landing." Webb didn't answer immediately. His attention focused on the approaching aircraft whose landing lights were now visible through the palm trees. In 15 years of special operations, he'd seen pilots attempt some incredible things, but what appeared to be happening above them challenged everything he thought he knew about the capabilities of fixed-wing aircraft. The C-130's engines grew louder, and suddenly the beach was bathed in brilliant white light as Kieran brought the aircraft into its final approach. The SEAL teams could see the massive silhouette of the Hercules hanging impossibly low over the water, its 4 turboprops churning the air with enough force to bend the coastal vegetation. "Jesus Christ," whispered Corporal Danny Morrison, the team's youngest member, as he watched the aircraft line up parallel to the shoreline. That crazy pilot's going to try to land on the beach. The enemy fighters in the tree line had noticed the approaching aircraft too, and their fire shifted from the SEAL positions to the slow-moving target presenting itself against the night sky. Tracer rounds began reaching up toward the C-130, creating deadly streams of light that crisscrossed the approach path. But Kieran held her course, adjusting for wind and incoming fire with the same steady precision that had earned her instructor pilot status back at Little Rock Air Force Base. She could feel the aircraft responding to every input, the massive machine dancing on the edge of its performance envelope as she brought it down toward a landing zone that existed more in hope than reality. "Flaps 40, landing checklist complete," Torch called out, his voice tight with concentration. Behind them, Flight Engineer Master Sergeant Paul Chen monitored engine parameters that were already redlining as they pushed the C-130 beyond its designed limits. The beach rushed up to meet them, and in the final moments before touchdown, Kieran could see individual SEAL team members sprinting toward what they hoped would be their salvation. The margin for error had shrunk to nothing, and success would be measured not in feet, but in the precious seconds it would take to get 43 men aboard before the tide, the enemy, or the laws of physics made their rescue impossible. The main landing gear touched wet sand at precisely 3:52 hours, and the world exploded into controlled chaos as thousands of pounds of aircraft met an improvised runway that had never been designed to support anything heavier than a beach volleyball. The C-130 shuddered and bounced, its massive tires throwing up plumes of sand and seawater as Kieran fought to keep the aircraft tracking straight down the narrow strip of beach. "Engines to ground idle, reverse thrust," she commanded, feeling the aircraft's weight settle onto gear that groaned in protest against the uneven surface. The left main gear hit a depression in the sand, causing the entire aircraft to lurch violently to port before Kieran could correct with rudder and differential braking. Through the windscreen, she could see SEAL team members emerging from the vegetation line, some carrying wounded comrades, all moving with the purposeful urgency of men who understood that their window of escape was measured in minutes, not hours. Muzzle flashes still lit up the tree line as the remaining teams provided covering fire, but the incoming rounds were getting closer to the stationary aircraft. "Ramp down, engines turning," Delgado reported from the cargo bay, her voice carrying over the intercom with professional calm that belied the unprecedented nature of their situation. She'd already lowered the aircraft's rear loading ramp, creating a pathway for the waiting extraction team. Webb was the first aboard, helping carry a Marine whose leg had been mangled by shrapnel during the earlier firefight. 30-second count, sandstorm, he transmitted, knowing that every moment they remained on the ground increased their vulnerability to the enemy forces that were undoubtedly repositioning to attack the rescue aircraft. But even as Neptune 6's personnel streamed aboard, Kieran faced a new problem that threatened to turn their successful landing into a catastrophic failure. The incoming tide had transformed the hard-packed sand of their touchdown point into a soggy mess that was rapidly becoming unsuitable for takeoff. Each passing second saw more seawater seeping into the sand, reducing the surface's ability to support the aircraft's weight during the critical takeoff roll. "Chen, I need maximum power settings," Kieran called to her flight engineer, her eyes scanning the engine instruments for any sign of the overheating or mechanical failure that could strand them on this narrow strip of contested beach. "We're going to have one shot at this, and it's going to be ugly." The loadmaster's voice crackled through the intercom with the words they'd all been waiting to hear. 43 souls aboard, ramp secure, ready for departure." Kieran advanced the throttles to maximum power, feeling the C-130's engines surge to life with the raw authority that had made the Hercules the workhorse of military aviation for more than half a century. But this takeoff would test every limit of the aircraft's capabilities, demanding performance from an airframe that was already operating far outside its intended parameters. The aircraft began its takeoff roll down the beach, its tires throwing up a rooster tail of sand and spray as Kieran fought to maintain directional control on a surface that was part runway, part swamp, and entirely hostile to the physics of aviation. In the space of 10 heartbeats, Major Kieran Valdez transformed from a competent but underestimated transport pilot into something approaching legend. The C-130's nose lifted off the deteriorating beach surface at the exact moment when physics and desperation intersected, the massive aircraft clawing its way into the night sky, with 43 rescued souls breathing collective sighs of relief in the cargo bay. But the real test was just beginning. As the aircraft climbed through 500 feet, enemy forces opened up with everything they had, turning the night sky into a deadly light show of tracer fire and surface-to-air missiles. A shoulder-fired SA-7 streaked past the left wing, missing by mere meters, while automatic weapons fire stitched holes through the aircraft's tail section. Taking fire from multiple positions, Chen reported with characteristic understatement, monitoring systems that were already showing damage indicators across multiple displays. We've got hydraulic pressure dropping on System 2, and I'm seeing fuel flow anomalies on Engine 3. Kieran banked hard left, using the darkness and her knowledge of local geography to break contact with the ground-based threats. Behind her, the rescued SEAL teams were already setting up a defensive perimeter inside the cargo bay, their weapons trained on the open ramp just in case their escape wasn't as clean as it appeared. Neptune 6, secure for tactical departure, Delgado announced, her voice carrying the authority of a senior NCO who'd seen enough combat to know when to prepare for the worst. The rescued personnel strapped themselves into whatever seats they could find, while the wounded were secured on medical litters that the loadmaster had prepared during their brief time on the beach. Webb made his way forward to the cockpit, his face still bearing the grime and exhaustion of 3 days in hostile territory. Sandstorm, I don't know what we just witnessed back there, but that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever seen. How copy? Kieran's response was typically understated, her attention focused on nursing the damaged aircraft through the darkness toward friendly airspace. Just doing my job, Neptune 6. Let's get you all home. But even as she spoke, warning lights were illuminating across the instrument panel, and the C-130's flight characteristics were becoming increasingly sluggish as battle damage took its toll. The mission was far from over, and the next few hours would test every skill that Kieran had accumulated during her decade-long career as a military pilot. The wounded aircraft flew on through the night, carrying its precious cargo towards safety, while its pilot quietly performed the kind of miracle that would be studied in aviation schools for generations to come. As the C-130 limped through Iraqi airspace at reduced power settings, word of Sandstorm's beach landing began spreading through military communication networks with the speed of wildfire. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Rodriguez was pulled from a staff meeting to take an encrypted call from CENTCOM headquarters. "Sir, we need you to listen to this recording," came the voice of his operations officer. "It's the radio traffic from the Neptune 6 extraction, and frankly, nobody here believes what we're hearing." The recording played Webb's desperate call for extraction, followed by Kieran's matter-of-fact acceptance of a mission that should have been impossible. Rodriguez found himself leaning forward as he listened to the technical discussions between pilot and crew, the calm professionalism masking what was clearly an attempt to rewrite the basic rules of military aviation. "Who is this pilot?" Rodriguez asked, already knowing that he was hearing something that would change how the Air Force thought about transport operations in hostile environments. "And please tell me we have confirmation that this actually happened." Meanwhile, aboard the damaged C-130, Kieran was dealing with a new set of problems that threatened to overshadow her successful beach landing. Engine 3 was running rough, its exhaust gas temperature climbing toward redline values that would force a shutdown. The hydraulic system damage was making the aircraft increasingly difficult to control, and fuel consumption was higher than normal due to the battle damage, affecting the aircraft's aerodynamics. "Boss, we need to start thinking about alternate landing sites," Torch suggested quietly, his eyes scanning the navigation display for airfields that could handle their emergency. "Kuwait International is still 400 miles out, and I'm not sure we're going to make it on 3 engines with this fuel situation." But Kieran had already considered their options, and she'd reached a conclusion that would have surprised the critics who'd questioned her judgment throughout her career. "We're going home, Torch. Neptune 6 didn't survive 3 days in hell just so we could dump them at the first convenient runway." In the cargo bay, Navy Corpsman Santos was working frantically to stabilize the most seriously wounded Marine, a young corporal whose internal injuries required immediate surgical intervention. The makeshift medical station that Delgado had established was equipped for basic trauma care, but it was clear that their patient needed a real hospital, not a field dressing station 30,000 feet above hostile territory. "Sandstorm, this is Doc Santos," the corpsman called forward on the intercom. "I need to get Corporal Martinez to a trauma center within the next 2 hours, or we're going to lose him." The weight of that information settled over the crew like a lead blanket. Every mile they flew was another minute stolen from a young Marine's life, and every decision Kieran made carried the potential for consequences that would extend far beyond the technical success or failure of their mission. Webb, who had been monitoring the medical situation, made his way back to the cockpit with the news that no pilot wanted to hear. "Sandstorm, we need the fastest route to definitive medical care. I'll take responsibility for any tactical risks." But Kieran was already adjusting their course, her mind calculating fuel consumption rates against distance to friendly territory, weighing the aircraft's deteriorating condition against the life of a wounded Marine she'd never met but for whom she was now responsible. The C-130 pressed on through the darkness, its crew performing the kind of quiet heroism that rarely made headlines but formed the backbone of military operations around the world. The first hint that Kieran's beach landing had attracted attention beyond the immediate tactical situation came when her radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. The voice belonged to Colonel Hayes, but the background noise suggested she was no longer in her comfortable operations center at Ramstein. "Sandstorm, this is Olympus Actual. Be advised, I'm inbound to your location aboard Reach 47. We're going to provide escort service for the remainder of your transit." Through the darkness off their right wing, the distinctive silhouette of another C-130 materialized, its navigation lights blinking in the international pattern that identified it as a friendly aircraft. But this wasn't just any transport. Reach 47 was the call sign assigned to senior officer aircraft, and Hayes' personal involvement meant that their mission had escalated far beyond a routine extraction. "Olympus Actual, Sandstorm copies," Kieran responded, her voice betraying none of the surprise she felt at having her wing commander personally escort them home. "Appreciate the company. Be advised we're dealing with battle damage and medical emergencies." "Copy all, Sandstorm. We've got a full medical team aboard and tanker support standing by if you need fuel. Just get those boys home." But even as Hayes provided reassurance about their tactical situation, Kieran faced a more immediate problem in the form of Corporal Martinez's deteriorating condition. Santos had been providing constant updates from the cargo bay, and none of the news was encouraging. "Pilot, we're losing him," Santos reported, his voice tight with frustration. "His blood pressure's dropping, and I can't stabilize the internal bleeding with what I've got back here. How much longer to friendly territory?" Torch worked the navigation problem with the urgency of a man who understood that every minute mattered now. 90 minutes to Kuwait International if we maintain current speed, but we could cut that to 70 if we push the power settings. Kieran didn't hesitate. Push them. Chen, give me everything those engines have left. The flight engineer's hands moved across his panel with practiced precision, advancing power settings that would normally be reserved for emergency situations. The wounded C-130 responded with a surge of speed that brought them closer to safety, but also pushed their damaged systems toward the breaking point. Behind them, Colonel Hayes watched their aircraft's performance through night vision goggles, noting the unusual exhaust patterns that indicated engine damage and the slight asymmetric flight attitude that suggested control system problems. She'd flown combat missions herself during the early days of the Iraq War, and she recognized the signs of an aircrew pushing their machine beyond normal limits. In the Pentagon, senior Air Force leadership were receiving preliminary reports of an operation that seemed to defy both tactical doctrine and basic physics. The idea that a C-130 could successfully operate from a beach landing zone challenged fundamental assumptions about transport aircraft capabilities, and early discussions were already beginning about the implications for future operations in contested environments. But for the crew of Sandstorm's aircraft, the only thing that mattered was getting their passengers to safety before the wounded Marine's condition deteriorated beyond recovery. As Kuwait International Airport appeared on their navigation display, Kieran began the preparations for an approach that would be complicated by their aircraft's battle damage and the urgent need for immediate medical attention upon landing. The beach landing that had seemed so impossible just hours earlier was now overshadowed by the equally challenging task of keeping everyone alive long enough to reach definitive medical care. The final approach to Kuwait International would test every skill that Kieran had developed during her years as a transport pilot, but it would also cement her reputation as someone who could deliver miracles when the situation demanded nothing less. The control tower at Kuwait International had been alerted to expect an emergency landing, but even their experienced controllers were unprepared for the radio call they received as Sandstorm approached the airport perimeter. Kuwait Tower, this is Air Force Sandstorm, declaring emergency for battle damage and medical priority. Request immediate clearance to runway 27 left, ambulance standing by. Sandstorm, Kuwait Tower, you are cleared for straighten approach runway 27 left. We show medical and fire rescue positioning at taxiway Charlie. Winds 090 at 15 knots, altimeter 3012. But as Kieran began her descent toward the well-lit runway, the aircraft's damaged control systems presented her with a new challenge. The hydraulic problems that had been manageable at altitude were becoming more severe as she reduced power and configured the aircraft for landing. The flight controls felt increasingly sluggish, requiring greater control inputs to maintain the precise flight path that would put them safely on the runway. "Chen, talk to me about backup systems," she called to her flight engineer, her attention divided between flying the approach and monitoring the cascade of warning lights that were illuminating across the instrument panel. "Manual reversion is still available, but it's going to be heavy," Chen responded, already running through the emergency procedures that would give them manual control of the aircraft if the primary systems failed completely. "Primary hydraulics are holding for now, but I wouldn't count on them for a go-around." The implication was clear. They would get one chance at this landing, and failure wasn't an option with Corporal Martinez's life hanging in the balance. In the cargo bay, Santos was performing CPR on the wounded Marine, his efforts hampered by the aircraft's unstable flight path, but sustained by the knowledge that medical help was waiting just minutes away on the ground. Webb had positioned himself near the cargo door, ready to coordinate the medical evacuation the moment they touched down. Around him, the other SEAL team members maintained the alert posture that had kept them alive during 3 days in enemy territory, but their expressions reflected the profound gratitude of men who understood exactly how close they'd come to never seeing home again. As the runway threshold approached, Kieran made the subtle adjustments that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. She compensated for the crosswind, adjusted for the aircraft's heavy weight and altered center of gravity, and managed the power settings with the precision that came from thousands of hours in the cockpit of military transport aircraft. The main landing gear touched down on Kuwait International's runway with a solid thump that indicated a successful landing, but Kieran's work was far from over. The damaged C-130 required careful handling during the rollout, and she used differential braking and rudder inputs to keep the aircraft tracking down the center line as they decelerated toward the waiting emergency vehicles. "Good landing, Sandstorm," came Colonel Hayes' voice over the radio, her escort aircraft following them down to provide moral support during the final phase of their mission. "Medical team is standing by." As the C-130 rolled to a stop at the predetermined parking spot, doors burst open on waiting ambulances and medical personnel sprinted toward the aircraft's cargo ramp. Corporal Martinez would be in surgery within minutes, his life saved by the split-second decisions and professional competence of a transport crew that had refused to accept that any mission was impossible. But even as the immediate crisis resolved itself, Kieran knew that their beach landing would generate questions and investigations that would extend far beyond this single mission. The medical evacuation of Corporal Martinez proceeded with the efficiency that characterized American military logistics at their finest. Within 6 minutes of touchdown, the wounded Marine was aboard an ambulance and speeding toward the military hospital at Camp Arifjan, where surgical teams were already prepped and waiting. As the last of Neptune 6's personnel deplaned from the cargo bay, Webb made his way to the cockpit to thank the crew that had pulled off what he was already describing as the most incredible rescue operation of his career. But when he reached the pilot's station, he found Kieran slumped in her seat, her hands still gripping the control yoke with the white-knuckled intensity of someone who'd just performed aviation magic. "Sandstorm," Webb said quietly, "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you pulled off back there. How are you holding up?" Kieran looked up at the SEAL team leader, her face reflecting the exhaustion that came not from physical effort, but from the mental strain of making life-and-death decisions under impossible circumstances. "Just glad we got everyone home, Commander. That's what we're here for." But Webb could see the toll that the mission had taken on her, the weight of responsibility that came with being the person everyone counted on when conventional solutions weren't available. He'd seen the same expression on the faces of other warriors who'd been tested beyond normal limits and found themselves capable of things they'd never imagined. Outside the aircraft, maintenance crews were already beginning their assessment of the battle damage, their preliminary examination revealing holes in the fuselage and tail section that spoke to just how close they'd come to disaster during their escape from the beach. Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the senior maintenance supervisor, whistled softly as he surveyed the damage pattern. "Ma'am, I've been working on C-130s for 23 years, he told Kieran as she conducted her post-flight inspection, "and I've never seen an aircraft take this kind of damage and keep flying. You and your crew did something special tonight." But even as Williams spoke, both he and Kieran knew that the real assessment would come from the technical investigation that would examine every aspect of their mission, from the decision to attempt the beach landing to the aircraft handling techniques that had made their escape possible. The Air Force took aviation safety seriously, and unconventional operations like theirs would generate detailed analysis and official scrutiny. Colonel Hayes approached the aircraft as the maintenance assessment continued, her expression mixing professional pride with the concern of a commander who understood the political implications of what her pilot had accomplished. Successful or not, Kieran's beach landing had pushed the boundaries of accepted doctrine, and there would be questions from senior leadership about risk management and tactical decision-making. Major Valdez, Hayes began formally, but then shifted to a more personal tone. That was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I've seen in 20 years of military aviation. Right now, I'm leaning toward brave, but there are going to be people who disagree. Kieran nodded, understanding the subtext of her commander's words. Military careers had been ended by successful missions that were deemed too risky in hindsight, and her beach landing would be analyzed by people who'd never faced the choice between attempting the impossible and abandoning American forces to an uncertain fate. The debriefing would begin within hours, but for now, Kieran allowed herself a moment to appreciate the simple fact that 43 American servicemen were alive, because she'd been willing to ignore the voice that said it couldn't be done. The formal debriefing began at 800 hours in a secure conference room at Camp Arifjan, with participants joining both in person and via encrypted video link from commands around the world. Kieran found herself facing a panel that included her immediate chain of command, representatives from Air Mobility Command Headquarters, and senior officers whose presence indicated the strategic importance being attached to her unconventional landing. Major Valdez, began Brigadier General Sandra Mitchell, the Air Mobility Command representative appearing via video link from Scott Air Force Base. We're here to understand exactly what happened during Operation Neptune 6 extraction, specifically your decision to attempt a landing on an unsurveyed beach under hostile fire. The questions that followed were professional but pointed, focusing on the risk assessment process that had led to her decision and the technical aspects of operating a C-130 in an environment for which it wasn't designed. Kieran answered each query with the factual precision that characterized her approach to flying, but she could sense the underlying tension between those who saw her actions as heroic and those who viewed them as dangerously reckless. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, a safety officer from Air Force Headquarters, pressed particularly hard on the technical aspects of the landing. Major, what made you believe that a beach surface could support the weight of a fully loaded C-130? Our technical manuals specifically prohibit operations from unprepared surfaces without engineering surveys. Sir, the technical manuals also prohibit abandoning American forces to enemy capture when extraction is possible, Kieran replied, her voice carrying a quiet authority that had been earned through years of making difficult decisions under pressure. I assessed the risks and determined that the probability of successful extraction exceeded the probability of aircraft loss. But it was Webb's testimony that shifted the tone of the debriefing from investigative to appreciative. The SEAL team leader's account of the tactical situation, delivered with the precise language of someone who understood both the military and political implications of the extraction, painted a clear picture of the impossible choice that Kieran had faced. Sirs, Neptune 6 was 30 minutes from being overrun, Webb stated flatly. Without Sandstorm's intervention, we would have faced capture or death. Major Valdez didn't just save our lives. She preserved operational security for multiple ongoing missions and prevented an international incident that could have compromised American interests throughout the region. The revelation that Neptune 6's capture could have exposed other classified operations added a dimension to the mission that hadn't been fully understood during the initial emergency response. Suddenly, Kieran's split-second decision to attempt the beach landing looked less like reckless bravado and more like strategic brilliance. General Mitchell's expression shifted as she absorbed the broader implications of Webb's testimony. Major Valdez, it appears that your actions prevented consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your account of the mission? Kieran considered her response carefully, understanding that her words would become part of the permanent record and would influence how future similar situations might be handled. Ma'am, I believe that when American forces are in contact with the enemy, our job is to find solutions, not excuses. The beach landing was unconventional, but it was also effective. 43 men came home, and that's what matters. The debriefing continued for another 2 hours, but the fundamental tone had been established. Kieran's actions would be studied and analyzed, but they would not be criticized. 3 weeks after the Neptune 6 extraction, Kieran received orders that would change the trajectory of her career in ways she couldn't have anticipated. The assignment came directly from the Pentagon, signed by officials whose names carried weight throughout the Department of Defense, and it carried her to a world far removed from the routine transport missions that had defined her military service. The Special Operations Test and Evaluation Unit at Hurlburt Field, Florida, was where the Air Force developed new tactics and procedures for its most challenging missions. It was a place where conventional thinking went to die, replaced by innovative approaches to problems that couldn't be solved through standard doctrine. And it was where Kieran found herself assigned as the lead pilot for a new program designed to expand the tactical employment of transport aircraft. "Major Valdez," said Colonel David Chen, no relation to her former flight engineer, the unit commander who briefed her on her first day, "your beach landing got people thinking about capabilities we didn't know we had. We want you to help us figure out what else is possible." The Tactical Transport Enhancement Program was classified at levels that required clearances Kieran had never held, but its basic premise was straightforward. Determine how transport aircraft could be employed in ways that current doctrine considered impossible. Her beach landing had become the proof of concept for an entirely new approach to military aviation. Working with test pilots, engineers, and special operations personnel, Kieran began developing procedures for operating C-130s in environments that challenged every assumption about transport aircraft limitations. They practiced landings on highway strips, mountain meadows, and frozen lakes. They developed techniques for rapid cargo delivery in contested airspace and explored methods for extracting personnel from locations that conventional wisdom deemed inaccessible. But it was during a training exercise at Nellis Air Force Base that Kieran's reputation truly solidified within the special operations community. Tasked with extracting a simulated downed aircrew from a narrow valley surrounded by hostile forces, she executed a landing on a dirt road that required splitting the difference between two rock formations with a margin of error measured in feet. The observer team included officers from every branch of the military, and their reaction was captured in an after-action report that would become legendary within special operations circles. "Major Valdez has demonstrated capabilities that fundamentally alter our understanding of what constitutes a viable landing zone. Her techniques shall